Welcome to the new chapter of the environmental science subject, chapter 2, Science, Matter, Energy, and Systems. In this chapter, we will be able to answer some overview questions. First of that is, what is science and what do scientists do? Second, what is matter? What are the basic forms of matter and what makes matter useful as a resource? Third, what happens when matter undergoes change? Fourth, what is energy and what happens when it undergoes change? And lastly, what are systems and how do they respond to change? Now imagine if a logging company cut some trees in your backyard. What do you think would be the effect to your surrounding environment? So one way to learn about such effect is to conduct a controlled experiment, just as environmental scientists do. So they begin by identifying key variables such as water loss and soil nutrient content that might change after the forest or the trees are cut down. So they can then set up two groups. One is the experimental group in which a chosen variable is changed in a known way, and the other is a control group in which the chosen variable is not changed. So the goal there is to compare the two groups after the variable has been changed and to look for differences resulting from the change. So that's the case here for the core case study, a story about a forest that happened in Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest in New Hampshire. So the scientists, led by botanist F. Herbert Borman, forest ecologist Gene Likens, and their colleagues, compared the loss of water and nutrients from an uncut forest with one that has been stripped. So the uncut forest is the control site and the stripped one is the experimental site. So in this picture, this is our control site. And this second one is our experimental site. So what did they do? So they built a V-shaped concrete dams across the creeks here, a V-shaped dam, so that but at the bottom of several fossil valleys in the experimental forest, they can measure the amount of water that's leaving its forested valley and measure the volume and the salt nutrient content. So whatever water that is being flowed down or flowed across these valleys, two valleys, it will go here at the bottom so they can measure the volume and the salt nutrient content. So that's the way to determine if there's change. So what did they find out? So they found out that in the stored forested area in one of the valleys, which is the controlled one, is very efficient at storing water and retaining chemical nutrients in its soil. While the strip site, it shows that it has 30 to 40% more runoff, meaning water is not really stored much here when compared to the control site. So because the runoff is 30 to 40% more and more dissolved nutrients. Why? So there's no more trees to how do you say this? There's no more trees here to stop nutrients from being eroded down here at the bottom. So when you compare the nutrient contents from both sides here at the bottom for the control and the experimental site, it shows that more nutrients is being eroded here at the bottom when compared to the controlled one. And another um, observation, more soil erosion happened. So that's what happens when you cut a tree in a forest area. In that core case study, you've been given a brief background of what do scientists do. And that is our first question that we will be answered in this lecture. What do scientists do? So what do scientists do? First is they collect data. Then second, they form hypotheses. And third, they develop theories, models, and laws about how nature works. Now, science is a search for order in nature, and it is an attempt to discover how nature works. It is also used by scientists to make predictions about future events in nature. In observations, experiments, and models are used by scientists to know how nature works. And another one is scientists are very curious and skeptical human beings. They demand a lot of evidence. So when you're in a research track, it demands a lot of skepticism, and it should be reproduced, easily reproduced, and is being peer reviewed by several colleagues. Science and scientists alike have several characteristics. First, they're both curious. They demand or desire to know more about something. And second, they're skeptics. So there's room for doubt in science, and for science and scientists there is always room for doubt because we both know the doctrine that true knowledge or knowledge um, can always be uncertain. And third, any science or science research must be easily reproduced, and they should also be peer reviewed by colleagues in that field, and also they are open to new ideas. So they are always open, so they are not closed to new ideas, so there's room to skepticize the results of their studies. And also, science and scientists should always have critical thinking, meaning there's always an objective analysis and evaluation just to form a judgment. Lastly, creativity. So we need to be more creative, or scientists are creative. So instead of making an imitation, there's always room for creating something. So this are the characteristics of science and scientists. And in research results like scientific papers must be peer reviewed and can either be rejected as well, but if it's accepted, then the paper can be published in scientific journals, and research can be evaluated also by scientific community. Now in science, there are two types of reasoning. We have first is the inductive reasoning. It involves using specific observations and measurements to arrive at a general conclusion or hypothesis. It is a bottom-up reasoning going from specific to general. For example, based on years of findings, based on years of results from biologists, they have arrived to a conclusion that all organisms are made of cells. So that's an example of inductive reasoning. The second reasoning is deductive reasoning. So this reasoning uses logic to arrive at a specific conclusion. It is a top-down approach that goes from general to specific. So back to that example. So deductive reasoning is just the opposite of inductive reasoning. So a while ago I said that an example of inductive reasoning is from base of years of findings from biologists, they have arrived to a conclusion that all cells are made of organisms. An example of deductive reasoning is from general rather to specific. So scientists, they say that if all organisms are made of cells, so that's their general observation or their general conclusion. So if all organisms are made of cells and humans are organisms, then the humans are made of cells. Then that's the conclusion. So just the opposite from inductive reasoning. So they go from general to specific. And also, scientists test hypotheses when conducting research. So when they want to find or they want to know something, so one important factor in research is testing hypotheses. So scientists test hypotheses using controlled experiments and constructing mathematical models. Then variables or factors influence natural processes, just like our core case study. There is a variable there or a factor that will determine the result of the experiment. And single variable experiments involves a control and experimental group. And most environmental phenomena are multivariable and are hard to control in an experiment. Now we proceed to the steps in the scientific process. So the first step in the scientific process is identifying the problem or the issue. And next to that is find out what is known about the problem, and we do that by doing literature research. Then next is to ask a question that needs to be investigated. So what is the unknown of that problem? Then perform an experiment to answer the question and to collect the data. So after collecting the data, we analyze the data and check for patterns. A well-accepted pattern in data is what we call a scientific law. So after analyzing the data, we propose a hypothesis to explain the data. So our hypothesis is your observation of what could be the possible reason behind the problem. And after that, we use the hypothesis to make testable projections. And next to that is perform an experiment to test that projection. So if it is accepted, then it can be can lead to the scientific theory or a well-accepted hypothesis. But if it needs revision, then we need to make more testable projection. So after making another testable projection, we test it again through an experiment. And if it's accepted, then that's a scientific theory that is well tested and widely accepted. So it's not necessary that we'll follow all these steps in the scientific process, because some scientists do proceed with making hypothesis or proposing a hypothesis, and they test that hypothesis and then they perform an experiment, and if it's accepted, then it became a scientific theory. So it's not necessary that we follow these steps, but these are the features in the scientific process. Now here's an example of how to test and hypothesize a hypothesis. So the first observation there is nothing happens when I try to turn on my flashlight. So what could be the question there? What could be the problem? Why the flashlight is not turning on? So the question is, why didn't the light came on? So our hypothesis then is maybe the batteries are dead. So that's our hypothesis. So that's our projection. So what would be the experiment there? So we need to test this hypothesis with an experiment. So we put in new batteries and try to turn on the flashlight. And the result was the flashlight still does not work. So since the flashlight is still not working, we need to do another hypothesis. What could be another reason why the flashlight is still not turning on, since we've already put a new battery? So the next hypothesis would be maybe the bulb is burned out. So the bulb of the flashlight might be burned out. So we need to test that as well again. So we put in a new bulb. And the result was the flashlight works. So in conclusion, the new hypothesis is verified. This is the reason why the bulb or the flashlight is not turning on. So we've arrived with a conclusion. So that's an example of testing the hypothesis. It's also important to note that scientific theories and laws are the most important results of science. A scientific theory is widely accepted. It is supported by extensive evidence and is accepted by most scientists in a particular area. But scientific theories can be revisioned. It can also be disproven. So that's the scientific theory. While scientific laws, it's the law of nature. It can not be changed anymore. It's the law of nature. So it's universally accepted. So it cannot be disproven or revisioned at all. And the results of science can be tentative or can be reliable. It can be unreliable. So tentative science is like a frontier science that has not been widely tested and the starting point of peer review. And the next one is reliable science. It's a sound science that consists of data, theories, and laws that are widely accepted. And then we have unreliable science or junk science. It is presented as sound science without going through the rigors of peer review. Also, science has some limitations. One of that is particular hypotheses, theories, or laws have a high probability of being true while not being absolute. Second, bias can be minimized by scientists. Third, environmental phenomena involve interacting variables and complex interactions. And environmental phenomena are multivariables, so it cannot be easily controlled in an experimental setup. Then, statistical methods may be used to estimate very large or small numbers. And scientific process is limited to the natural world. Also, science focuses on statistics and probability. And inadequate data and scientific understanding can limit and make some results controversial. So scientific testing is based on disproving rather than proving a hypothesis. So it could be based on statistical probabilities. Statistics is just the collection or organizing and interpretation of numerical data, while probability is the chance that something will happen or be valid, and probability also needs large enough sample size. Here's another core case study that perfectly encapsulates what science is. So this core case study is the environmental lesson from Easter Island. Easter Island is a island on 3,600 kilometers off Chile, and it was rumored there that a thriving society of lived there and have reached a population of 15,000 people by 1400s. So, but they use resources faster than could be renewed. So by 1600, only a few trees remain. So this causes a lot of chaos, famine, then fighting among these rival clans. So it led to the collapse of their civilization. And by 1722, only 700 people, several hundred people left. But another scientist um, proposed a revision with this environmental story using anthropological studies and scientific measurements. So in his revision, the Polynesians arrived about 800 years ago, and that the population only 3,000. It didn't reach 15,000 people at all. And then one of the reasons that may have caused in the decline of trees, although the Polynesians did live unsustainably and use up a lot of their trees, one of the reasons also that is that rats may have multiplied and eaten the seeds of the trees. So that's why some of the trees really, or the population of, or the forest itself in that island degraded because of the inclusion or the introduction of rats in the island. So that's an example of how a popular science story or research has been revised and disproven. Now that we've answered what scientists do, we now then proceed to answering the question, what is matter? So matter is anything that is consists of elements and compounds which are in turn made up of atoms, ions, or molecules. So matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. So it can be living or not. And matter exists in two chemical forms. We have elements and the compounds. So an element it has a unique property and it cannot be broken down chemically into other substances. So if you look at the table of elements, it is represented by one or two letter symbol. So for example, we have hydrogen. That's the symbol. How about sodium? Na. Then for gold, Au. So it can be a one letter or two letters. Now gold is derived from the Latin word aurum. So they use the first two letters of that Latin word, and that's the representation for gold. And then compounds, meanwhile for the compounds, it is a combination of two or more elements bound in fixed proportions. So an example for that, we have NaCl, NaCl, or sodium chloride. So it is a combination of two elements that are chemically bonded. As what I've mentioned a while ago, elements and compounds are made up of ions, atoms, and molecules. And these atoms, ions, and molecules are found in three physical states. We have the solid, the liquid, and the gas. But a fourth state is also in play, which is plasma. It is a high energy mixture of positively charged ions and negatively charged electrons. So the suns and stars consist mostly of plasma. And scientists have made artificial plasma like in their TV screens, in lasers and fluorescent lights. And these are two examples of the elements. We have gold and mercury, Hg. Table are some of the most commonly used elements in the book Living in the Environment. So we have arsenic, bromine, calcium, carbon, chlorine, fluorine, gold, lead, lithium, mercury, nitrogen, phosphorus, sodium, sulfur, and uranium, and with their corresponding symbols. They are two letters or it can be one letter. Now, atoms, ions, and molecules are the building blocks of matter. So in the atomic theory, It's stated that all elements are made of atoms. So carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, they are all made of atoms. And for each atom, R contains subatomic particles. So one of that is the protons, which is positively charged or positively charged. And then the neutrons with no charge, so they are neutral. They have no charges in the nucleus. So these two are found in the nucleus of the atoms. For this, if this is an atom, then this is our nucleus. It is made up of several protons and neutrons. And then we have the negatively charged electrons, or the negatively charged electrons. So electrons, they are the ones that is traveling around the nucleus of an atom. So an atomic number is the number of protons in the nucleus. If you look at the table of elements, for example, the hydrogen, its atomic number is 1. So this is the atomic number. Atomic number. So the atomic number indicates the number of protons, that is found here in the nucleus. So in hydrogen, only one proton is found in its nucleus. So another is the mass number. The mass number is just the number of protons plus the neutrons in nucleus. So the total number of protons and neutrons that is found on an element's or an atom's nucleus. Now this picture shows you the atomic model of carbon-12 atom. And why it's called carbon-12 atom? Because it has 6 protons, 6 neutrons. So 6 plus 6 is 12. So that's its atomic mass, 12. So we name it carbon-12 atom. And it has also 6 surrounding electrons. Now, elements can be in different form. It can be an isotope. So an isotope is a form of an element that have the same atomic number but different mass numbers. For example, carbon has 3 isotopes. We have carbon 12, carbon 13, and carbon 14. So what's the same between these 3 isotopes is their atomic number. And atomic number is just the total or number of protons present in their nucleus. So carbon 12 has 6 protons, the same with carbon 13 and carbon 14. What differs is their atomic mass numbers. And we all know that the atomic mass number is just the sum or the total of protons and neutrons present in the nucleus of an atom. So carbon 12 has 6 neutrons and 6 electrons as well. Carbon 13 has 7 neutrons, 6 electrons. And carbon 14 has 8 neutrons and 6 electrons. So if we look at the atomic mass numbers for these 3 isotopes, we total this one and this one and this one. So that's why they have different mass numbers, because 6 plus 6 is 12, 6 plus 7 is 13, and 6 plus 8 is 40. So that's what you call an isotope if their atomic mass numbers are different. And also, elements, molecules, or compounds can also be ions. What are ions? So these ions are elements or compounds that gains or loses electrons. So they're either positively charged or negatively charged. Then these elements can also form ionic compounds. So an example for that, we have hydrogen ion. Hydrogen ion is positively charged because it loses electrons. And then we have hydroxide ions. It's negatively charged because it gains electrons. Another one, we have sodium. Sodium can be positively charged because it can lose electrons as well. And then we have chlorine or chloride. It can be negatively charged because it can gain electrons. So these elements, these ionic elements, can also form ionic compounds. For example, sodium and chloride. It can form sodium chloride. Okay, so that's what you mean by ions. Now, in relation to ions, um, another important factor or concept that we need to learn is pH, or the measure of acidity. So pH stands for the power of hydrogen, so or potential of hydrogen. So these ionic compounds, we can also measure the whether it's acid, base, or neutral. And we all know that the neutral number for pH is 7. Below 7 is acid, and above 7 is base. So that's what do you mean by pH. So let me show you a table of some of the ions positively and negatively that are primarily or prominently used in our main reference book, The Living in the Environment. So we have here hydrogen ion. So one H atom, one positive charge. It's positively charged because it can lose one electron. We have sodium ion. We have calcium ion, aluminum ion, and ammonium ion. An example for negative ions, we have chloride ion, hydroxide ion, nitrate ion, carbonate ion, and sulfate ion, and also phosphate ion. So see the difference? This is one element. This one is two elements, so it's ionic compounds, and this is an ionic element or molecule. Okay, sure. I'm gonna show you the scale, the pH scale. What food or food items that are bases or acidic or neutral. So as we all know, pH is the potential of hydrogen, is the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution, in a 1 liter of solution. So logarithmic 10 of 0, or that's pH log 0 for hydrochloric acid. We have gastric fluids, press gastric fluid, they are in range of 1 to 3 per pH, so that's really acidic rather. So we have some lemon juice and acid rain, we have vinegar, beer or oranges, we have tomatoes, bananas, black coffee or bread, and so on and so forth. These are acidic food items in nature. And we have pure water, which is neutral. We have 7, pH is 7. And then the next items, they are all in base form because their pH is 8, it's 9, or 10. Go back to our first core case study, A Story of a Forest, that was conducted in Hubbard Brooks Experimental Forest in New Hampshire. One of the factors that are being measured there to determine the change is soil nutrients, and that specific nutrient is nitrate ions. So in this graph, I'm going to show you the loss of nitrate ions, the comparison between the deforested one and the controlled one. So the blue one represents the undisturbed forest or watershed, where the loss of nitrate ions is constant but low. Compare that to the red one, which is the disturbed one, from 1963 to 1966, it was constant, but it gradually increases. It rises to 60, even close to 60 milligrams per liter. So that's the difference between those two watersheds. The compounds primarily used here in the main reference, our main book reference, the living in the environment, we have sodium chloride, sodium hydroxide, carbon monoxide, and so on and so forth. There are molecular compounds, ionic compounds, intermetallic compounds, and complex compounds. We also have organic compounds, and they are the chemicals of life. Basically, these compounds makes life possible. So, an organic compound contains at least two carbon atoms and other various atoms. But there's an exception to that because there's a compound that is considered still an organic compound with just one carbon atom, and that is CH4 or methane. And this methane is an example of a hydrocarbon. And we also have a chlorinated hydrocarbon. Example to that is DDT. DDT, which stands for dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, or the popular insecticide. So, a chlorinated hydrocarbon is just a combination of an atom of chlorine, hydrogen, and what's the other atom? The carbon. So that's the chlorinated hydrocarbons. And we also have simple carbohydrates. So a simple carbohydrates is a combination of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So example to that is glucose, or the C6H12O6. So C6H12O6 is an example of a simple carbohydrate. And we also have macromolecules or complex organic molecules. Example to that is complex carbohydrates, we have proteins, we have nucleic acids, and we have lipids. Now next to organic compounds, we also have our inorganic compounds. And inorganic compounds are those compounds without the presence of the carbon atom. So here's an example of a simple complex organic compound, the glucose, with its structure. So this is its acyclic structure, and this is acyclic structure, and this one is the cyclic structure. So glucose is present in plants, especially in plants that contain starch, and glucose also is present in algae or fungi because they are also photosynthetic organisms. So this is just an illustration of what glucose is in its cyclic and acyclic structure, and it can be in a chain form, chain of glucose units that is inside a plant, like a potato. Complex macromolecules like amino acids and proteins. So this is its structure of an amino acid. We have its amino group and its carboxyl group, and also a valine. So the chain of amino acids, this one is what made up a protein. Another complex macromolecule is the DNA and RNA. It's nucleotide structure. So this is what composes a DNA, so or a deoxyribose ribonucleic acid and a ribonucleic acid or RNA. So a DNA or an RNA contains a phosphate group, a 5-carbon sugar, and its nucleotide base. Now this illustration shows you the DNA double helix structure and the bonding. So a while ago we've said that a nucleotide contains a phosphate group, a 5-carbon sugar, and its nucleotide base. So a string of or a chain of this nucleotide is what we call a DNA strand. And in a DNA, it is made up of 2 strands linked together. So here is the first strand and here is the second strand. So they are linked together by a hydrogen bond. So these are the nucleotide bases of a DNA strand. We have the thymine, the cytosine, the adenine, and then the guanine. So they are linked together by a hydrogen bond. This one, this. And we also have another complex macromolecule, a fatty acid structure and triglyceride. So here it's the structure of a fatty acid or lipid, and this fat molecule is just a composition of 3 fatty acids bounded to a glycerol, and this which is called the triglyceride. So a triglyceride is what composes a fatty tissue or an adipose cells. Now without matter, life wouldn't be possible because there won't be any genes, chromosomes, and cells. So these cells are the fundamental units of life. It is the most fundamental, structural, and functional units of life. Then all organisms are made up of 1 or more cells. Now within a cell is a gene. A gene is a sequence of nucleotides within the DNA that contains instructions for proteins and create inheritable traits. So these genes can be found in a chromosome. So a chromosome is composed of many genes and DNA. So these chromosomes also can be found in a nucleus of the cells. So again, the cells are the fundamental units of life. So here's an example of the two types of cells. We have the prokaryotic cell. So these are cells found in bacteria and viruses because they lack a distinct nucleus. So here's an example of a prokaryotic cell. So it has a cell membrane where transport of raw materials and finished products occurs, and it also has a protein construction and energy conversion organelle, which is what we call the ribosomes. Ribosomes, if you remember your um, high school biology. And it also has a information storage where the DNA and the genes are found, but it has no nucleus. It has no distinct nucleus. And also another cell is the eukaryotic cells, which is found in plants and animals and also we humans. So it has a distinct nucleus. So here you can see that it has the nucleus. This is the nucleus. This is where we can find the chromosomes, and within that chromosome is our genes, which is composed of a strand of DNAs. So the gene is responsible for the information storage, where the traits that we inherit from our parents or from our mother and father are stored. And it also has an energy conversion center, or the organelle, what that we call mitochondria. Mitochondria. If you can remember your um, high school biology, the organelle responsible for the conversion of energy is the mitochondria for animals, and chloroplast for the plants. And it also has our protein construction or synthesis, the ribosomes. The ribosomes. And for packaging, we have the Golgi apparatus. And the membrane, the membrane surrounding the cells, is where the transport of raw materials and finished products happens. So this is where matter comes to life. So from a human body contains a certain trillions of cells, each with an identical set of genes. So each human cell, except for red blood cells, contains a nucleus. And each cell nucleus has an identical set of chromosomes, which are found in pairs. And a specific pair of chromosomes contains one chromosome from each parent. So the X and Y chromosomes, if you can remember your high school biology. And each chromosome contains a long DNA molecule in the form of a coiled double helix. So I've shown that a while ago, the form of a double helix. It contains two strands of nucleotide chain. And we have genes that are the segments of DNA on chromosomes that contains instruction to make proteins, the building blocks of life. Now, some forms of matter are more useful than the others. So we have two types of matter. We have high quality matter, which is highly concentrated and near Earth's surface and has a high potential as a resource. And then we have a low quality matter. This is not highly concentrated. It's deep underground or widely dispersed. It has a low potential as a resource. Now here are examples of the differences in matter quality. So for high quality and low quality. So a solid is a high quality matter, and then gas is a low quality matter. And a salt is a high quality, but when you dissolve it in a solution, in a water solution, it becomes low quality. Then a coal, when it's burned in power plants or coal-fired power plants, it becomes a gas, so it becomes a low quality matter. Same with gasoline. If it's burned by automobile and it becomes an emission of smoke, it becomes low quality. And also an aluminum cut is an high quality matter, and then it becomes low when it became a aluminum ore. Now we proceed to the third section of this chapter, which is what happens when matter undergoes change. Now, according to the law of conservation of matter, whenever matter undergoes a physical or chemical change, no atoms are created or destroyed. For example, in a physical change, there is no change in chemical composition. An example to that is melting of ice. So from its solid state, the ice melts into its liquid form, and the chemical element or composition is still the same, H2O. How about chemical change? So there is a change in chemical composition. So the reactants, for example, a wood. If we burn a wood, so the catalyst for this is the fire. So it will create a new product, which is coal. So there is a change in chemical composition. Then we also have nuclear change. So nuclear change happens when there is a natural radioactive decay, especially for radioisotopes. Radioisotopes are elements of are atoms that have unstable protons and neutrons. So another example of nuclear change is nuclear fission and nuclear fusion. So as discussed a while ago, matter undergoes physical, chemical, and nuclear changes. In a physical change, chemical composition does not change, but the state changes. So from solid to liquid, or liquid to solid, or solid to gas, and gas to solid, etc. So for chemical change, there is a change in chemical composition. For example, here, the reactants here is the carbon and the oxygen. So if we add these two elements, it creates carbon dioxide, which is a new product, and then energy. So C plus O2, it creates CO2. And this is a representative structure. So from a black solid carbon and a colorless gas, it creates a colorless gas, which is CO2 and energy. As also discussed earlier, there are three types of nuclear change. We have radioactive decay, nuclear fission, and nuclear fusion. A radioactive decay occurs when the nucleus of an unstable radioisotope emits fast-moving chunks of matter like alpha particles, this one, and gamma rays, this one, and beta particles. And this is what happens when a nuclear fission occurs. So a large mass isotope like uranium-235 is hit by a neutron and is being split into smaller fragments. This one, and it split continuously. Meanwhile, nuclear fusion happens when two lighter elements of two isotopes like hydrogen 2 and hydrogen 3 are forced together at an extremely high temperature that they form a heavy nucleus and releases high amount of energy. Moving on to the fourth section of this chapter, which is what is energy and what happens when it undergoes change. Now, energy can come in many forms. The first type of energy is kinetic energy. So kinetic energy is found in flowing water or waves, in wind, and in heat via radiation, conduction, or convection, and also through electromagnetic radiation. For example, the kinetic energy from the wind moves this turbine. So that's a kinetic energy. And another energy is potential energy. This is a stored energy and can be changed into kinetic energy. An example to that is a water behind a dam, a stored water behind a dam. So the energy is stored in there, but if we release that water, it becomes a kinetic energy. So these are just the two of some forms of energy, potential and kinetic. Now we come to the electromagnetic spectrum. So the electromagnetic spectrum represents the different types of energy that comes from the electromagnetic radiation from the sun. So organisms vary in their ability to sense different parts of the spectrum. So the longer the wavelength, the lower the energy. But the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. So the visible light is the only spectrum that can be seen by organisms like us humans, but those with shorter and some with those longer wavelengths, they are invisible to us. So these are some of the um, electromagnetic spectrum energies that is present in an electromagnetic radiation. We have gamma rays, so they have shorter wavelengths, so it has higher energy potential. We have X-rays, then we have radiation, and then the visible light. This part is the visible light. Then we have infrared radiation, microwaves, and TV radio waves. So the one that is quite visible to us is the visible light, this one. Now the sun is the major source of energy for Earth, and it provides us with 99% energy. So this 99% energy usually is found in warming the Earth to comfortable temperature and in plant photosynthesis. Now winds, hydropower, and biomass are just indirect form of renewable solar energy. Indirect form of solar energy. Now, while the 1% remaining are fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas. Just like matter, some types of energy are more useful than the others. So there's also high quality energies. So it has a high capacity to do work and more concentrated. Example of that is high temperature heat, strong winds, and fossil fuels. So also the nuclear energy to electromagnetic radiation are high quality energy. How about low quality energy? So low quality energy are low capacity when it comes to work, and they are dispersed. So ocean heat is an example of low quality energy. So the two types of energy as discussed earlier are the high quality energy and low quality energy. So the sources of energy should also match the quality of energy needed to perform a task to avoid the energy waste. So in this picture, I've showed you the source of energy and the task that it can do. So an example here is electricity, very high temperature heat, nuclear fission, Nuclear fusion, concentrated light, and high velocity wind are types of very high quality energy. So it is very useful for industrial processes and producing electricity to run electrical devices or lights or motors. Then we also have high temperature heat at 1000 to 2500 degrees Celsius. Hydrogen gas, natural gas, gasoline, coal, and food are high energy quality. So it is used for mechanical motion to move vehicles and industrial processes and producing electricity as well. For a normal sunlight and moderate wind velocity and high velocity water flow, concentrated geothermal energy, wood and crop waste, these are moderate type of energy and they are used for industrial processes as well, for cooking and producing steam and electricity and hot water. The dispersed geothermal energy that are low temperature heat are very low quality energy. So they are only responsible for space heating. So it can perform space heating. If matter is governed by the law of conservation of matter, then energy is governed by two scientific laws. First is the law of thermodynamics, first law of thermodynamics, which is the law of conservation of energy. It states that energy is neither created nor destroyed in a physical and chemical change. So the second law states that energy always goes from a more useful to a less useful form when it changes from one form to another. An example is light bulbs and combustion engines. So they produce wasted heat. So from a useful one, it became a wasted one. So it less useful one. This illustration shows the second law of thermodynamics in action in living systems. So each time energy changes, so from solar energy, from one energy form to another, some of the initial input of high quality energy is degraded. So this one is degraded and becomes wasted heat, usually to low quality heat, and is dispersed into the environment. From solar energy to chemical energy, waste is wasted, heat is wasted. Then from chemical energy to another chemical energy for food, so heat energy is wasted also. And then from chemical energy to mechanical energy, so for movement of the organisms, for moving, thinking, and living, energy is wasted once more. And on to the last section of this chapter is what are the systems and how do they respond to change. So systems have inputs, flows, and outputs of matter and energy and feedback that can affect their behavior. So these are the components of a system. We have a system, a set of components that interact in a regular way. So just like the human body, the earth, and the economy. So it's composed of several systems. So in the human body, we have the nervous system, we have the circulatory system, the respiratory system. So that's an example of a system. So in a system, there are inputs, so from the environment, and also flows and throughputs of matter and energy. And then we have the outputs. Outputs are the feedback. This is a simple representation of the inputs, throughputs, and outputs of an economic system. So we have inputs from the environment, then the throughputs, and the outputs to environment. For example, we have energy resources, matter resources, and information as our inputs. And the throughputs is system processes. So the processes that is utilized to, for example, to convert a certain matter into a product or a manufacturing product or a device. So these are throughputs the system processes. And the inputs are work or products, waste and pollution, and heat. Now, systems respond to feedback loops. So it can be either a positive feedback or a negative feedback. When you say positive feedback, it causes a system to change further in the same direction. So, for example, in a forest ecosystem, a human cut some forest or cut some trees. So it causes a change. And that change could lead the system, the forest ecosystem, to further degrade in the same direction, to degrade in the same direction, the straight direction. So it can cause major environmental problem. The other one, which is a negative or corrective feedback loop, it causes systems to change in opposite direction. So, for example, the one example I stated a while ago, in the forest, and some humans cut some trees, but they did something also that will try to correct that um, direction in which it will totally degrade. So they did reforestation. So that type of change causes the ecosystem, the forest ecosystem, to recover. So the system changes into the opposite direction. So that's a negative or corrective feedback loop. So this is an example of a positive feedback loop. So the watershed ecosystem. So decreasing vegetation. So when we strip or cut trees, so we decrease the vegetation in a watershed. So it leads to erosion and nutrient loss. So if this continues and there's no positive correction or correction that is being made, it causes the vegetation to die and led to this one. So that's an example of a positive feedback loop. Another example in a economic system. So in a sustainable high throughput economies works in straight lines. So they convert resources to goods in a manner that promotes waste and pollution. So if an economy uses high quality energy and matter, and then the system or throughputs that they're using are very unsustainable, so it's wasted processes that are wasting matter and energy. So the outputs will be low quality energy and heat and waste and pollution, and it works in a straight line in the same direction. So that's an example of a positive feedback loop in the economic system. So another example of a negative feedback loop is when you put a heating system in your house. So you turn on the furnace in your house and the house warms. So the house warms. But the throughput, the process, you've inserted a process that when the house warms and when it reaches its desired setting, the furnace will automatically turn off. Then the furnace turns off, then the house cools. So instead of a straight line where the furnace will just keep on turning, keep on working, and the house keeps on getting warmer and warmer, you put a throughput system that will automatically turn off the furnace so that the temperature will cool down once more. So that's an example of a negative feedback loop. So another example of a negative feedback loop system is the economy system that is sustainable low throughput economies. So they are matter recycling and reuse economies that works in circle. So these economies mimics nature by recycling and reusing, thus reducing pollutants and waste. So if it is not sustainable for growing population, this type of system economy. So this is a simple illustration of a low throughput economy. So the inputs from the environment and the system throughputs, and we have our outputs into the environment. So a low throughput economy um, based on energy flow and matter recycling works with nature to reduce the throughput of matter and energy resources. So the throughputs that is being reduced here is the energy via energy conservation and waste and pollution to achieve sustainable low waste economy. So the quality of energy that is output is low, as well as its waste and pollution, because the throughputs are using pollution control and recycling and reuse of um, most non-renewable matter resources. So another one, also reducing unnecessary consumption and emphasizing pollution prevention and waste reduction and controlling population growth. Time delays can allow a system to reach a tipping point. So a complex system will often show a time delay or a lack of response during a period of time between the input of a feedback stimulus and the response to it. So for example, scientists could plant trees in a degraded area, such as the one in our core case study, the number one core case study, the Hubbard Brook Experimental Forest, to slow erosion and nutrient loss. But it would take years for the trees and other vegetation to grow in order to accomplish this purpose. So time delays can allow an environmental problem to build slowly until it reaches its threshold level or tipping point. So the threshold level is the point at which a fundamental shift in the behavior of a system occurs. So prolonged delays dampen the negative feedback mechanism that might slow, prevent, or halt environmental problems. So in the Hubbard Brook, so if soil erosion and nutrient losses reaches a certain point where the land could no longer vegetation, then the tipping point would have been reached. The tipping point would have been reached, and it would be futile to plant trees alone to try to restore the system. So reforestation could no longer um, prevent it from being degraded fully. So another example of a tipping point is the melting of polar ice in the North and South Poles. And then another one is population growth. Then also, system effects can be amplified through synergy. So synergetic interaction. This is two or more processes that when combined together, it brings greater effect than the two separate. So it could be helpful effect or a harmful effect. A helpful effect or synergistic interaction is when you are studying with a partner. So when you study together, then the resulting knowledge you obtain will be more greater. Then in a harmful way, for example, smoking. And when you're smoking, um, the possibility of catching up lung cancer is fivefold. But if we combine smoking and inhaling asbestos particles together, then the effect would be 50 times the the possibility of taking up lung cancer. Are very useful in studying systems. So they help in identifying major components of systems and interactions within system, and then write equations about that system. So you can also use these equations by using computer. We will be able to describe the behaviors of such system, and you can also use it to compare projected behavior with the known behavior. And also, a good model can be also used to answer if and then questions. These are the three big ideas for this chapter. So the first big idea is there is no way. So according to the law of conservation of matter, no atoms are created or destroyed whenever matter undergoes a physical or chemical change. Thus, we cannot do away with matter. We can only change it from one physical state or chemical form to another. Then the second big idea is you cannot get something for nothing. So this is first according to the first law of thermodynamics, or the law of conservation of energy. So whenever energy is converted from one form to another in a physical or chemical change, no energy is created or destroyed. This means that in such changes, we cannot get more energy out than we put in. Then the third big idea is you cannot break even. So according to the second law of thermodynamics, whenever energy is converted from one form to another in a physical or chemical change, we always end up with lower quality or less usable energy than we started with. So those are the three big ideas in this chapter: science, matter, energy, and systems. So this ends for our chapter 2, science, matter, energy, and systems, and we have our references here from Miller GT and Spoolman SE, Living in the Environment, 17th edition.